Chapter 6, Freedom versus Determinism. This is the problem we're going to be considering in this chapter. Do we have free wills? Or are we determined by factors outside of our control? In philosophy, the subject we're considering is called the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is a problem that's come to the fore as a result of the widespread acceptance of materialism or atheism. And for all intents and purposes, these two terms are synonymous. Here's the problem. If there is no supernatural realm, if the material realm is all that exists, the scientist Carl Sagan used to say, the universe is all that exists or has ever existed. Okay. Assuming that is true, then there cannot be a soul in the human body. There cannot be some sort of mind that operates independently of the physical brain. Therefore, our consciousness, our sense of self, the idea that you are having self-caused thoughts at this very moment, or the idea that you have a free will, must be an illusion. The truth must be that you are a biological or a social machine. You're programmed by your biology, things like your genetic code, or by your environment. You've heard of the nature versus nurture debate. It has to do with the mind-body problem. Are we programmed by our nature, by biological forces over which we have no control, or are we programmed by our environment over which we have no control? It has to be one or the other, or both perhaps, because if the materialists are correct, if the atheist is correct, there is no soul, there is no ghost in the machine. The mind-body problem impacts the study of morals and ethics because it ultimately calls our own existence, or our existence as we perceive ourselves to exist, into question. You see, we perceive ourselves to be moral, free agents. We have a free will, and so we are able to choose between options, between moral options. But if we are machines, programmed by nature, nurture, or some combination of the two, how can we be held responsible for anything we think, say, or do? Because in the final analysis, we have no choice but to do what we have been programmed to do. So we are not truly morally responsible creatures at all, no more so than you can hold a computer morally responsible for what it has been programmed to do. The cartoonist Bill Watterson, who produced what is, in my opinion, the greatest comic strip of all time, Calvin and Hobbes, understood the problem. In this cartoon, we see Calvin and Hobbes walking together through the snow, and Calvin says, "Nothing I do is my fault. My family is dysfunctional and my parents won't empower me. Consequently, I'm not self-actualized. My behavior is addictive functioning in a disease process of toxic codependency. I need holistic healing and wellness before I'll accept any responsibility for my actions." And Hobbes says one of us needs to stick his head in a bucket of ice water. But Calvin's delighted. He says, "I love the culture of victimhood." Calvin apparently has come across the mind-body problem. If I am completely programmed by my environment, how can I be held responsible for anything I do? Nothing I do is ultimately my fault. And Calvin explains that he's in a dysfunctional family situation. His parents won't empower him. And minus self-actualization, he is not a morally responsible creature. How can you blame him for functioning the way he has been programmed to function? That is a good statement of the mind-body problem, at least what someone on one side of the question would say. The other side of the question holds to a dualism, that there is a material realm, there is a spiritual realm, there is a soul in the body that somehow interacts with the biological hardware. The other side, there cannot be such a thing. We must be determined by something. And that's the problem we're discussing in this chapter. Freedom versus determinism. And when we talk about freedom, we're talking about free will. Do we have one? Do we have freedom to choose between options? Or are we, in fact, just pre-programmed robots? Let's talk a little bit about the term determinism. Determinism means the same thing as universal causation. What's that? There's a cause for everything that happens in this universe. The universe is a closed system. And so everything that happens in this universe must have a cause. There's an effect. There was somewhere along the line a cause. We perceive ourselves to be thinking our own thoughts. We seem to ourselves to be making real choices. We have a self-awareness. There must be a cause for this. And since there is no spiritual realm, since there is no ghost within the machine, there is no soul, then something other than a spiritual causation, a mind independent of the brain, something other than that must be the cause of every effect, including those things we perceive erroneously to be true about ourselves. That we are conscious beings with a free will, having our own thoughts. Can't be, not if the materialist is correct. So we have to have some cause that it is determining our thoughts, our words, and our actions. Follows, there can be no such thing as an uncaused event. Now, as we have mentioned, determinism holds some serious implications for morality. How can we tell Calvin that he should do certain things, or that he ought to do certain things, that he ought not to do certain things? How can we do that, since Calvin ultimately has no choice, because he was either pre-programmed by his biology, or he is being programmed as he goes along by external factors outside of his control, or perhaps by some combination of the two. But whatever it is, Calvin cannot really choose to be either good or bad. He will ultimately do what he has been programmed to do. So how can we blame him? How can we praise him? How can we justly reward or punish him if he cannot help but acting the way he does? Let's go back to our computers. Our computer has some glitch. We don't get out the cat of nine tails and flog our computers, because we recognize that ultimately it's not the computer's fault. It's the fault of the program. It's a result of some flaw in the hardware. But we recognize that the computer is not a free moral agent, and so the computer cannot be held morally responsible for what it does. Atheistic materialists are not the only ones who have wrestled with the mind-body problem. Certain theological systems are also deterministic, and if one accepts these systems, you have the same problem. Islam, for example, is a very deterministic theological system. In Christian theology, you have Augustine and his later disciple, John Calvin. Both Augustine and Calvin, based on the Christian scriptures, believed that there is an all-powerful and an all-knowing God. And if God is all-knowing, and if God knows the future, then everything must be predetermined, because it is impossible to foresee an uncertain event. So if God accurately knows the future must be determined. And so every human being must be determined down to the most minute detail. The author talks about some of the problems he sees with religious determinism. He begins by arguing, as he often has, that there is no way of proving the existence of the Judeo-Christian God, this God that is all-powerful and all-knowing. And that is ultimately true. You can bring in evidence for the existence of such a God, but the evidence is not compelling to the point that we could say it's conclusive. But as we pointed out, you cannot conclusively prove anything, including, by the way, your own existence. That's one of the problems with the mind-body problem. How do you know that you even exist? Here's the problem. We're experimenting with AI, artificial intelligence, and it may be in the future that we would be able to create a computer avatar that thinks it exists, that thinks it has a free will, that thinks it is thinking its own thoughts, that has self-awareness. This computer-generated avatar is living in a universe it perceives to be real. It's interacting, doing things in that universe. But in fact, all of its thoughts are programmed from without, and all of its actions are being controlled by whoever is controlling the computer. Perhaps a joystick is making him move from place to place and doing thing to thing. But all the while, this avatar thinks it exists. Does it exist? Well, really, in a sense, it exists on the computer in the computer program, but once you turn off the power to the computer, it doesn't exist. You can boot it back up and suddenly it thinks it exists and it hasn't missed a beat. There are some very brilliant thinkers who believe that that may be the true nature of what we call reality. The head of Tesla Motors was asked about this. It's one of the things that's being kicked around by philosophers, and he said, if I put a number on it, there's a 1 in a million chance that we are living in a real universe and not living in some sort of computer-generated universe. And with that, there's 1,000,000 to 1 that we really exist. So when you get down to this question, can you prove something exists? Ultimately, not a thing. We have already seen in the last chapter that the author has his assumption. Actually, 2 authors, they have their assumptions. They're not innately more reasonable than any other assumption because assumptions are assumptions. They can't be proven. You say, I believe in the existence of a God who is all-knowing and all-powerful. That is a starting place for thought. To that assertion, you can accumulate evidence and make arguments. The assumption itself is no more unreasonable than its opposite, that there is no God. If you hold that position, you can collect evidence and you can make arguments to try to demonstrate that your assumption is correct. But ultimately, assumptions are just that. And ultimately, nothing, absolutely nothing, can be conclusively proven. And the very question of the mind-body problem is that, do you exist? Or are you just a machine? And when I say do you exist, certainly a machine exists, but we perceive of ourselves as much more than a machine. Is that true? If the materialist is right, no, we are just machines, and our perceptions are somehow an illusion. Interestingly, those religious systems that hold to strong views of predetermination have the same problem. If you accept Calvin's system, then you are forced to the conclusion that we do not really exist, certainly not as we perceive ourselves to exist. And you have questions concerning the goodness of this God that the Calvinist says exists. How can he hold machines who have no choice in their actions anyway, morally responsible for choices they could not help but make? They could not have chosen otherwise unless God gave them the ability to make some other choice. Ultimately, then God would be responsible for all of their actions, and God would therefore be the author of evil. So a system that proposes the sort of determination that is proposed by the Augustinian Calvinist view or by the Islamic view ultimately has some very serious problems theologically, and like the materialists, they're faced with the mind-body problem. The question, what are we then? If God is what you say he is, John Calvin, where does that leave us? What are we? And the answer to that question is one that people hold to a strong view of predetermination, don't like to address, and have a difficult time answering. The author also argues that most theories of salvation require some sort of free will. Interesting things here. First of all, that's not an argument, that's an observation. Going to an illustration we used before, you could have a math class and everyone gets the same wrong answer except for one student. The fact that the majority of the students got the wrong answer does not make their answer right. And so, in and of itself, this argument refutes nothing. It certainly doesn't refute the strong determinist, because that person would say, well, I take my stand on the scripture. My understanding of the scripture is that we have no free will and that everything is predetermined. And so you may believe we have a free will, but I stand on my interpretation, my understanding of the Christian scriptures, and therefore I'm right and you're wrong, even though most of you disagree with me. So it's really not much of an argument by majority. Truth is determined by majority, I suppose. I think the best argument is the argument I've made. Ultimately, the problem with all forms of determinism, whether it is religious-based determinism or some other form of determinism, is that it denies the existence of our basic humanity. It says that we are machines. And if machines, morally, free from responsibility, since we have no choice but to do that which we were pre-programmed or predetermined to do. We come now to scientific determinism, and we have a picture on the right of your screen of Sir Isaac Newton. Newton himself was a very religious man, and he would not have a problem with the idea that there is a spiritual realm and that there is a spirit or a ghost within the machine. But his scientific theories and the philosophies and the scientific theories that were built upon his insights did lead many who followed him to conclude that we are living in a completely material universe, that there is no supernatural realm, and that everything we think, say, or do is determined by physical laws outside of our control. They looked at Newton's findings, and Newton did posit that everything in the universe is caused by physical laws, the laws of gravity, the laws of motion. And those who followed him then looked at his work and said, well, if Newton is right in theorizing that everything in the material realm has a physical cause, then we must have a physical cause too. If everything we see is an effect caused by some previous cause, then everything about us must be explained on that basis. So we, like the apple that fall from a tree, do only that which the physical laws of nature demand that we do. The authors of our text talk about the problems with physical determinism. And they point out that natural law states probabilities and not certainties. And in this, they are really going beyond Newton, and they're looking at the work of David Hume, who would point out that even though something has happened every time we have observed it, we have no guarantee that it is going to happen the next time we observe it. An example of this is black swans. There was a time when it was assumed that all swans were white, that there was no such thing as a black swan. Every time you see a swan, it's white. But then they went to Japan, and lo and behold, they found black swans. And so, you could say you'll probably see a white swan if you're in Europe the next time you see a swan. But you cannot be certain that you will never see a black swan. The next swan you may see may be a black swan that is a result of a genetic anomaly, or maybe a black swan has been flown in from Japan. So natural laws talk about what will probably occur, not what will certainly occur. And modern physics, of course, have raised some doubts about Newton's physics and the causation of events. Certainly, Einstein's theories went beyond what Newton believed to be true of the universe. And then along came quantum mechanics, and no one has a precise handle on that, and no one's even figured out how we can unify all the things we know into a common theory of how things work. What we are discovering, though, is the brain seem to be operating on the basis of quantum physics, and we can't quite figure all that out. Very strange things. So, physical determinism, it would perhaps explain one thing: why, if I walk off a cliff, I will fall to the ground and be destroyed on the rocks below. The law of gravity. It's kind of best to go with that. But it cannot explain everything about us. And is it really sufficient to explain our self-consciousness? The sense you are having right now that you are thinking, or maybe you're sleeping and dreaming right now, I don't know. But is it sufficient to even explain that? The problem you often have is people come with an argument, a good argument that proves something, and they stretch it to try to use it to explain everything. In logic, this is called the reductive fallacy. You take something very complex and you try to explain it with some simple answer. And the answer is often something that does explain something, but it is not sufficient to explain everything. And I would use that argument in looking at all of these forms of determinism, whether we're talking about theological determinism, whether we're talking about scientific determinism, or any of the other determinisms we're going to be discussing. All of them seem to me to be reductionist. The individuals who offer these theories have discovered a principle that explains a certain aspect of reality. Their problem comes as they try to stretch it too far and use it to explain everything. We come now to biological and genetic determinism. The face we associate with that is Charles Darwin. He, of course, is the father of the theory of evolution, and his explanation for everything was natural selection. Evolutionary psychologists like Jonathan Haidt, who we've discussed earlier, believe that everything is ultimately the result of natural selection. Darwin believed that nature then determines what we are going to be and ultimately what we are going to do. So in the nature versus nurture controversy, Darwin came down strongly on the side of nature. Human beings, he believed, are totally determined by their genetic makeup, over which they have no control, and we're driven ultimately by forces over which we have no control and sometimes don't even understand. For example, let's say that you find yourself attracted to a person of the opposite sex and you have feelings that you believe are love. What is actually happening here is you are being driven by the desire to pass on your genes. And you have found what you believe to be a suitable person through which you can pass on your genetic material. And if the feeling is mutual, a baby is produced and the genetic material is passed on. And so whatever you are thinking when you are bringing the flowers to someone, when you are involved in physical intimacy with someone, what your body is trying to do is reproduce. And it is the body that is driving you and producing the chemicals you associate with love. But in fact, you would say, I'm in love, but the fact of the matter is you're just in chemical. Well, let's talk about the problems with biological or genetic determinism. The authors of our textbook bring up the argument I made when we were discussing scientific determinism or physical determinism, the reductive fallacy. Charles Darwin did discover a tremendous principle when he observed natural selection. It was so wonderful, in fact, that he tried to use it to explain everything. And this is something I would say to the evolutionary psychologists such as Jonathan Haidt. You are right. Natural selection can explain a lot about human action. But it is insufficient to explain everything about us, our mental and our spiritual side. I want to comment on what the author said there in just a minute. But let me give you an example of a couple of things that I think natural selection just can't explain. Art. What competitive advantage does the painting of a picture or the sculpting of a statue or the composition of a symphony have to do with biological survival, passing on the genetic material? Certainly natural selection can be used to explain a lot about us, and it can explain a lot of our thoughts, and it can explain a lot of our actions. But the author is arguing, and I agree with him, that this problem is, it is an example of the reductive fallacy. While natural selection explains a lot, it is insufficient to explain everything we see human beings thinking, saying, and doing. The authors also mention a spiritual side, and this may surprise you because if you are a religious person, you may have been offended by the first chapters of this book because it seemed like the authors of our textbook are making an attack on spirituality. And as I've mentioned, they're approaching the subject of ethics from an atheistic standpoint, saying we cannot conclusively prove the existence of God. They have left God out of their moral equation. And now they're opening up the possibility of a spiritual dimension, a spiritual aspect to human existence. Literally, a ghost inside of the machine. The possibility that there may be a spiritual explanation for some of our actions. Well, the authors will continue to take their shots at Western religion, specifically the Judeo-Christian theological and ethical tradition throughout the rest of the textbook. In the last chapter, they're really going to take some whacks at it. But in that last chapter also, they make it clear that they are open to Eastern philosophy and Eastern spirituality. And so the authors who are going to come down on the free will side of the mind-body debate recognize that if there is not a spiritual dimension, then a discussion of morality and ethics is a waste of time because people are going to do what they're programmed to do. So they don't want to go there. And they have realized if there is not a spiritual dimension to humankind, then morality is undermined and it does not exist. And so they apparently are open to Taoism, Buddhist thought, something of that nature. But they have decided that explaining human beings as just machines determined by nature, nurture, or a combination of both, is insufficient. It reduces the complexity of human thought, feeling, action in such a way that ultimately destroys our humanity. We come now to the other side of the coin. We've been talking about those who believe we are determined by our nature. Now we're going to begin to look at those who believe we are determined by our nurture, by our environment. And this brings us to George Hegel, who can be viewed as one of the originators of this particular school of thought. George Hegel believed in historical or cultural determinism. He believed that there is an absolute mind that is trying to realize itself in perfection and manifest itself throughout the history of the world. You could think of this as God does not exist, but God is forming. He's evolving. God is not yet self-conscious. And history is producing this absolute mind. You live in a moment in history, and you are determined by the moment in history in which you find yourself. Now, there is some truth in this. An illustration here, most of you would probably argue passionately against slavery. But what if you were born the son of a plantation owner, the heir to the plantation, and you're living in the year 1840? Your father owns hundreds of slaves. What is your view of slavery going to be if you happen to be born in that particular time, in that particular place? Well, obviously, you would be able, and most likely, you would be making passionate arguments in defense of slavery, arguments that you would never make today. You would assume that these thoughts you're having, which form the basis of your argument, are your own thoughts, and that you're speaking as you argue and giving voice to the thoughts that have occurred to you in your own mind. But Hegel would say that is really not the way it happens at all. You think the way you do because you just happen to be born at the moment you happen to be born into. You are the product of your historical culture. Human beings therefore, are completely determined by their past and by the present moment that they happen to find themselves in historically, and the culture that has developed to the point that they make their entry into human history. Now, the author talks about some problems with historical determinism. He makes an observation: it's difficult to prove the existence of both an absolute mind and a mind that can exist without a body. The authors of our text have not seen enough science fiction, because I'm sure there's an episode of Star Trek out there somewhere where Spock and Kirk come across some mind existing without a body in outer space. So certainly something like that can be conceived. The author says it's difficult to prove the existence of this absolute mind, or mind without a body. As we pointed out, whenever you read that word, it is difficult to prove. That's not an argument, that's an observation. And it's a good observation, because as we point out, it is impossible to prove conclusively the existence of anything, including your own existence. That's what the mind-body problem is ultimately all about. So this is an observation that's being put forth as an argument, and as an argument, it proves nothing. The authors make another observation, which they present as a theory, that there are other theories of history besides Hegel's which are just as plausible, if not more so. All right, that would be similar to what we talked about when we talked about religious determinism. Calvin had his theory. Opposed to Calvin was Jacob Arminius, and then someone who was looking at the problem from another perspective, the Jesuit Molina. came up with another answer to the problem. So there are a lot of different answers or suggestions when it comes to the matter of determinism, but the existence of other theories proves nothing but the existence of other theories. And so Hegel would say, so what? I think my theory's better. You find it just as plausible, or some other theories out there more plausible than mine? Fine, that's your right, that's your opinion. I have a different opinion. Your argument is proof of nothing other than the fact that you and I have a difference of opinion. I continue to say the strongest argument against historical determinism is that it does, in fact, rob human beings of what we perceive to be our humanity. It does turn us into nothing more than pre-programmed robots who cannot be held morally accountable justly for anything we think, say, or do. We come to another form of social determinism, economic determinism. When we think of economic determinism, we think of Karl Marx. Because economic or social determinism in the Marxist form came from his theories. Marx says that human beings are determined by the economic class they happen to be born into and an ongoing class struggle. Marx believed that this would ultimately lead to a utopia. Eventually, the oppressed proletariat would rise up, cast off their chains, and they would throw off the shackles of the powerful, and we would have the world described in John Lennon's song, Imagine. Remember, John Lennon himself was a Marxist. Lenin, the name he took, was not the name he was born with. He chose to name himself after an intellectual hero, Vladimir Lenin. We talk about Marxist-Leninism. Economic determinism, if we can someday just, this class struggle is going to be won. Now, some individuals known as neo-Marxists would say this is an ongoing thing because eventually, you're right, the underclass is going to overthrow their rulers, and then they will become the upper class. There'll be a new underclass, and so it will repeat itself perpetually. But the idea when it comes to determinism is if you're born in a particular class, the class you're born into, the economic realities of the world are going to determine everything, including your every thought and your every action. The authors point out that there are some problems with this theory too. They say that the theory is based on unproved assumptions. Well, wait a minute. In the last chapter, they say their theories are going to be based on unproved assumptions too. And I pointed out that all logical thought is based or built upon an unproven assumption. We start with an assumption. It is the human race's ability to hypothesize that makes rational thought possible. A hypothesis can be defined as faith. We are assuming something to be true that we cannot prove, that we have not observed. It is a theory, an unproven assumption. And on the basis of that, we gather evidence, we make arguments. So the fact that Marx based his economic determinism on unproven assumptions is just an observation. You could look at the authors of our textbook. They're going to present humanitarian ethics in chapter 8, and we could look at it and critique it and say, well, your theory is based on unproven assumptions. And you could point out that in chapter 5, they said that very thing. The authors then say, well, other theories are equally possible. Okay. Again, other theories are out there that neither proves or disproves Marx and Marxism. It just proves there's other theories out there. You can prove that there are a lot of theories, but in doing that, all you proved is that there are a lot of other theories. I continue to say that the strongest argument against determinism is that it is reductionist. Human behavior, thoughts, words, actions are so complex that any theory of determinism is going to need to be stretched. It's going to need to be extremely elastic to explain it all. And it is my opinion that that is the fault with all deterministic theories. You can stretch them only so far and then they break. They're insufficient to explain the reality of human thought, human action, human speech, human creativity, all of the things that go into the human experience. The authors add that there's non-economic influences too. Well, that's part of the argument I just made. Yeah, there are. And that's the problem with Marx. His theory can't be stretched far enough to explain everything. We come now to a man who had it all figured out, or thought he did, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud believed that there are psychological drives at work within us, and with Freud came the behaviorists. Freudian psychology maintains that human beings are affected by unconscious drives and by our attempts to repress these unconscious drives to the extent that our early childhood determines the course of our adult life. You've heard of the term perhaps anal retentive, speaking of some bad experiences during potty training, and Freud would suggest that that then is going to go into determining your behavior as you become an adult. The main criticism of this theory is, again, the author says too generalized to have any real basis in fact. They're making the same argument. It's reductionist. It's too generalized. You're trying to stretch a good argument that does prove something, because we do have certain unconscious drives. Do they explain everything about us, or some things about us? And the authors would say, well, they're too generalized. They explain some things, but they can't explain everything. And so the problem is reality tests the various determinist theories that we've looked at. And with all of them, it says, you're explaining an aspect of human behavior. Well, maybe we can take them all together. Still, all of them together, or it's nature or nurture or both. And there seems to be much more to the human experience than can be explained by any of the determinist theories, including psychological determinism. And ultimately, as I have been saying, all determinist theories force us to reach the conclusion that we don't exist. Not as we perceive ourselves to exist, as conscious, thinking, morally responsible beings. All determinist theories force us to conclude that we are robots of one kind or another. There was a man who had no problem with this. He also was a leader in the realm of psychological determinism, very popular thinker and writer when I was your age. B.F. Skinner wrote a book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and by freedom he meant free will. He was an advocate of psychological determinism, and he maintained that human beings are completely physical beings, again, no ghost in the machine, and our development is totally determined by external stimuli. He came down on the nurture side of the debate. That stimuli is our physical and cultural environment. The environment determines who we are, what we will think, and ultimately what we will do. Skinner believed that if you could engineer the proper physical stimuli, if you could physically engineer the right culture, that you could then determine the kind of human being that would be produced by that culture. You see echoes in this when someone says something happens and we go and want to find out what it was in this person's home background. What was it in his background that caused that person to do a particularly heinous crime? And the idea, though we don't often identify it, is determinism. Because we have been taught determinism, and so we assume that the person can't be held responsible. Certainly they didn't freely choose that. It must be their parents, it must be they were bullied in school, it must be that they came from a background of poverty, and so it goes. Because the human being is not responsible. It goes back to the Calvin Hobbes commercial. How can we blame anyone for anything given the fact that culture determines everything? The authors point out some problems with psychological determinism. They point out, as I've been saying all along, it's a completely materialistic view of the human being. Materialism is a euphemism for atheists. It is saying, in fact, that there is nothing but the material being. There is no spiritual dimension. And the authors then make it very clear that they are not materialists. They said this does not stand up to evidence or argument. So the authors, even though they are approaching the subject of ethics from a secular point of view, are making it clear that they do believe there is a spiritual dimension to reality. They have made it and will make it abundantly clear that they have very little use for the Judeo-Christian tradition. But they will also make it clear that they are very much open to and seem to be advocates of Eastern philosophy and religious thought. And so they are saying the real problem with psychological determinism, if I can paraphrase them here, is it's godless. Not godless in the sense that a Christian would use that term, but godless in the sense that someone in the Eastern religious systems would use that term. That we have to be more than just material beings. Otherwise, there is no such thing as morality. To talk about what we should do, ought to do, encourage people to choose to do the right thing, all of that would be so much silliness, because we cannot choose to be other than what we have been programmed to be. So the authors conclude that, like Freud's theory, Skinner goes too far in his claims. There is more to what we are than that which has impacted us in our environment, in our moment in history, in our culture. Problem again, it goes too far. It's reductionist. It takes a good argument, because certainly our culture has a tremendous impact on who we are, but it tries to stretch that argument too far and make it explain everything, and it is insufficient. It is unable to do that. At least that's what the authors of our textbook argue, and you might want to write down the date and time. I agree with them completely. Ultimately, determinism would lead to fatalism. Fatalism is the belief that all events are irrevocably fixed or predetermined, so we can't alter them in any way. And it is true that sometimes, many times, events are outside of our control. But it doesn't make sense, the authors argue, to act as if all events are outside of our control. They would argue that fatalism and ultimately determinism is not only reductionist, but it is impractical. Who lives their life this way? Who lives their life ultimately as though I have no free will, I have no choice? Even those who argue against free will are making arguments that would seem to suggest that they're having thoughts that are self-caused. So the authors would say, how do you live your life this way? When we talk about determinism, then, there are two forms of determinism. We've been talking about hard determinism. Hard determinism is the theory that all events are caused by factors over which we as individuals have no control. Hard determinists criticize those who hold another position, which we'll talk about, soft determinism, by questioning how you can possibly say that any event originates from within ourselves. Because they argue if you trace back causes far enough, you end up at something that is outside of your control. And so human freedom, in the sense of a free will, is ultimately an illusion, because in the final analysis, everything is caused by something outside of ourselves. There is no ghost in the machine. Or in the case of religious hard determinism, if there's a ghost in the machine, so what? It can't do anything. In contrast to hard determinism, we have soft determinism. Soft determinists maintain that there is universal causation. The determinists are right, the hard determinists, when they say everything in the universe has a cause. But unlike hard determinists, they believe that some things in this universe are caused by human beings exercising their free will. So we ourselves are the cause of some of the things that happen in the universe. Our choices ultimately will determine the course of our life. So we are then individuals with free will. We are not robots. There is a mind as well as a brain. There is a spirit as well as a body. As Pope John Paul II said, we are dust and breath. There is both, the breath of God and the dust from which we are made. The soft determinist, no matter what theology they are coming from or theological point of view they are coming from, believes there's a ghost in the machine. Therefore, we are morally responsible beings, and our choices are the cause of some events that happen within this world. Now, there is another point of view that was articulated by the great American philosopher William James, and his view was indeterminism. Indeterminists maintain that there is a certain amount of chance and freedom in the world and that everything is not caused. The other two views we've talked about here briefly, hard determinism and soft determinism, accept cause and effect, that there is a cause for every effect. An indeterminist would say, I don't think so. Some things just happen. They're not caused. William James argued that this is a kind of world he would want to live in. He desires such a world. He desires a world where there's novelty and spontaneity, where human beings are therefore completely free, radical freedom, not just free will within the limitations of, for instance, I can't fly, I'm limited by the law of gravity, but that we are free and we're creative. And he says, I desire that kind of world. So he felt that our striving for good over bad and our regrets over our bad deeds is evidence of the fact that we must have a free will, more free even than the soft determinist would say we are free. Some things just happen. There are some problems with indeterminism. Our authors point out it seems to be based on wishful thinking rather than evidence or logical argument. William James says, well, I would like to live in a world where there's just spontaneous things that occur. Well, okay, can you give me an example? Give us some evidence of an uncaused event. You just can't think of anything. Things don't just happen. And we understand this even as infants. An infant that just has the ability to hold its head up and turn its head when it hears something, if you make a loud clap, that little head's going to turn to see where that came from, because we understand intuitively that the world we are born into is a world of cause and effect. Now, I may say, I would prefer a world with novelty and spontaneity. Oh, great. I would prefer a world in which I could fly without an airplane, just like Superman. But you see, that's not the world we live in. The author goes on to say, if some events are totally uncaused, not caused by anybody, that's really no guarantee of human freedom at all. It really just guarantees that things happen. It says nothing about whether or not we ourselves are predetermined in everything we do or have some measure of free will. So the authors make an argument that I've made repeatedly in this series of lectures about their own arguments. At best, even if we could grant the existence of the universe William James wishes exists, his argument ultimately would prove nothing. Well, let's look at hard determinism and its arguments against freedom or free will. The authors point out that they push language out of context. Yeah, they kind of do, because moral language would have no context. It would actually be difficult to even talk about who we are if all we are is robots. Imagine two computers plugged in and communicating with each other, trying to figure out who they are. Well, you'd almost have to have self-awareness in those computers to have the argument or the discussion. How to even discuss such a construct? And as I've been pointing out, the arguments are reductive. They don't account for the complexity of human behavior. Each of the arguments we've looked at may prove something. The problem is that those who hold to these arguments try to use them to prove everything, and they just won't stretch that far. And finally, our authors say, like psychological egoists, the hard egoists try to reduce what is very complex to something simple, and they use the term I've been using. This reductionism will not work. The authors continue and argue that human minds, human perceptions, seem to be open-ended and creative. And it seems to us that we create our own experience in this world by the choices we make. Let's say that this afternoon I decide to take a canvas and I have some idea in mind, and on to that canvas I reproduce a thought in my mind. What determines that? Both the thought and the action. I think art is one of the most difficult things for the hard determinists to answer. Why a painting of a landscape as opposed to a painting of the ocean? Why a skyscape instead of the portrait of a human being? What determines such things? How do you explain not only human choice, but human creativity? We don't seem to be mere passive receivers of input. We seem to be more than that. We seem to be active seekers, and as the authors point out, argument I've just tried to explain, we're creators. Determinism just falls short of explaining everything about the human creature. We reach now the author's conclusions. They assert that soft determinism seems to be the only tenable position. And I would certainly agree with them on this, one of those rare moments of agreement between the authors and your professor. The authors continue, acceptance of the soft determinist position allows us to assign moral responsibility to human beings, to praise them, to blame them, to reward or to punish them, when it is justifiable to do so. And it would only be justifiable to either reward or punish someone if their actions merited one or the other. In the final analysis, it seems that we do have a will. If nothing else, we have a will. One of the most interesting reads you'll ever have is a book written by a Holocaust survivor named Viktor Frankl, founded his own school of psychological thought. And he is a person who developed his theories as a result of his experience in the death camps. He wrote a seminal book called Man's Search for Meaning. And the question he grappled with as he moved through the system that the Nazis had put together to eliminate people such as himself. He was a Jewish man, a trained psychologist. And he grappled with the question, what do I have left when everything I have is taken away from me? They took away my profession. They took away all my possessions. They have transported me to Auschwitz. They've taken away my clothing. They have shaved my body. They have tattooed a number on my arm. They've even taken away my identity. All that I've accomplished is left behind. I have now nothing. And so the question he grappled with is, what does a person have left when they have been reduced to nothing? And he reached the conclusion, the one thing that cannot be taken from me or anyone else going through this experience is our free will. We can still choose how we are going to respond to this circumstance in which we find ourselves in. And he talks about how different people chose different paths. Some, of course, chose suicide. They threw themselves on the electrical wire. Some of them were reduced to their basic instincts for survival. They became virtual animals. Others chose to handle the situation with dignity. Many of them didn't survive. But there in the camps, he saw nobility. He saw people that never lost their humanity. And he noticed that those who did best in this experience were those who chose to believe in something beyond the camp. He, for himself, the belief that someday I'm going to get out of here and I have this new psychological theory that I'm going to present to the world. And so people who chose to respond to the impossible situation with some sort of hope did better than those and survived longer than those who had no hope. His conclusion is so interesting. They can take everything away from me but my ability to choose. And whatever else is gone, I still have that. I like his argument for soft determinism. I want to close with this. This is my attempt to reproduce something that I saw a number of years ago. As I mentioned, I was a pastor for 40 years. And in one of my churches, I had a very interesting man who collected all sorts of historical memorabilia. And going to his house really was a museum. He had a couple rooms that were just piled full of stuff of historical importance. And he collected Native American artifacts. And he had this small wicker piece about the size of a silver dollar. And it was a piece that hooked onto the choker, the bone choker that a medicine man in the Sioux tribe would have worn. And it was not as complex as this, but it looked somewhat like this. It was a maze with a line down through the middle. At the top was the happy hunting ground. There were some teepees. I haven't put those on this chart. And you see a man at the bottom. And the man is facing a maze of life. He's going to start by choosing to go to the right or to the left. But the maze is all predetermined. It was put in place by the Great Spirit. And everything that will happen, no matter which turn this man takes, is predetermined and planned by the Great Spirit. But there are signs within the maze, some of them saying, don't turn here, this way. So there's warning signs and there's instruction signs. A person can disregard the signs. If they do, they may find themselves experiencing a bad consequence and they have to backtrack. But this is the path of life. The maze is predetermined. The outcome is predetermined. But within the maze, people make real choices. Now, this is a good picture of soft determinism. The idea that there are some things that are beyond our control, and we have to go one way or the other, but we do choose which way we're going to go, and we experience the consequences of our choice. Now, this is a pretty good job of philosophizing by a group of hunter-gatherers. Maybe your picture of such people is that they didn't have time for philosophy. People have always had time for philosophy. As they sit around the campfire, as they look at the stars, as they talk and attempt to understand life, hunter-gatherers also notice that some things that happen to us are just beyond our control. But they notice that the quality of the journey within that maze of events that are beyond our control ultimately is going to come down to the choices we make along the way. For Viktor Frankl, he found himself in a maze, and there were choices. It was terrible where he found himself, but there were choices. And wherever we are in the journey of life, soft determinism would say, there are choices. And the authors of our textbook and I are in complete agreement. This seems to be the only reasonable choice.